Hi, I'm Paweł Spychalski, and in today's video let me show you the best settings, or rather the tuning strategy or the tips and tricks how to make your INAV 2.5 fly amazingly, as far as this is of course possible, on the 5-inch multi-rotor mini quads. Yeah, the same mini quads that you can use with the Betaflight or IMUFlight or whatever else. However, in this video we will concentrate only on the acro performance, not on the GPS capabilities. I still have videos on this topic from like a year or even 2 years ago. Those settings or those advices are still valid. Today we will concentrate only and only on the basic flight characteristic, on the PID tuning, on the filters, and on the most important settings for the values, of course, for the 5-inch multi-rotors. So let me change the camera, let me open the INAV configurator, and let me show you everything you have to know about INAV 2.5 if you are using 5-inch multi-rotor mini quads. Although this video is mainly about the settings of the INAV 2.5 on the 5-inch multi-rotor mini quads, there is something I have to mention. When updating between the releases of the INAV, my suggestion is always to use full chip arrays. It is possible to update without erasing the whole configuration stored in your flight controller, but there is a chance that some of the banks, of the setting banks, will be zeroed without you knowing it. So my suggestion is to always flash with full chip erase and then either restore the settings from the CLI, the whole, but even better, selectively the settings that are worth restoring, and trusting slightly more as the INAV developers with the default values we put into the flight controller. This was extra piece of knowledge I'm sharing with you. Now let's begin with the most important settings for the 5-inch multi-rotors. And to be honest, the most important setting you will have to choose when working with the INAV 2.5 is answering this dialog after connecting for the first time to the INAV configurator. Yes, it is possible to use old legacy defaults or keep current settings, but my suggestion is absolutely not to do that. We spent a lot of time improving the default settings, and the default settings you might choose over here, for example, for the mini quads from 3-inch to 7-inch range. If you have something like that, it's really worth checking this out. Of course, the same applies for the airplanes and for the boats. So, what happens? Actually, what happens after you click that button? INAV configurator applies a lot of settings that are designed to make 5 inches or 3 inches or 7 inches multi-rotor fly the best. Those are very close, okay, maybe not the very, but close to the settings that, for example, IMUFlight or Betaflight offers. That means, not only that, and this allows to have the best flight performance out of the box. To be honest, if you just want to go flying, this is almost all you have to do. Of course, you still have to do the calibration, you still have to set up the mixer, because without applying the correct mixer you will not go far, but right now the PID and the filters are more or less fine for everything from the 3-inch to 7-inch range. But if we are talking about the 5 inchers, let's open the PID tuning tab and let's see which settings you might want to change if you want to make your multi-rotor, 5-inch multi-rotor, fly slightly better. Like I mentioned before, the default PID values are more or less fine for everything from 3 to 7-inch ranges, and those defaults are made in mind with the 5-inch multi-rotors. On the 5 inches, probably you will not really have to change PID values for roll, pitch and yaw. Possibly if you are experiencing slightly too much noise on the motors, you might want to lower derivative gains on the both roll and pitch, but only if you really feel that there is too much noise going into the motors. On the other cases, it's fine to leave those values alone. Also, if you are from time to time using acro or position hold on your 5 inches, the leveling strength is, let's say, slightly too low for the 5 inches. It's fully fine to set this to 35 or even 40, because we are talking about small and agile multirotors. They will pretty nicely handle with those values. The value is low intentionally because a lot of INAV users are using big, like 10, 8 or even 12 or even bigger multirotors, and then such a high leveling strength might be problematic. But with the 5 inches, it's fully enough to go to 35 or even 40 and even maybe 50, and it will be just fine. The angle mode and the horizon mode will be just a lot more snappier and nicer to feel. We will, for now, leave the TPA, the thrust PID attenuation, untouched, because this all depends on the let's say, how fine your multirotor is flying on the high throttle. This setting is designed to make the flight controller life easier, simpler, especially on the high throttle. In majority of the cases, it's possible to leave the PID thrust attenuation untouched. However, if you are experiencing some extra vibrations on the high throttle punches, it's a good idea to increase this value to 10, 20, maybe even 30% to lower the output that goes from the PID controller to the mixer on the high throttle. Because on the high throttle, when the motors are on the high RPM, they have much more authority, and it's possible that on the default values there is some overshoot, especially from the P gain. So when on the high throttle there is slightly too much vibrations, you might you might rise the PID attenuation, or maybe even lower the TPA breakpoint. This is also what Betaflight is doing, and I'm also using this on some of my quad. I actually start attenuation from the 1100 and set this to 30. This means that the full output of the PID controller will be applied on the low RPM of the motors and linearly scaled down together with the progress of the throttle input. That's probably all on this subtab. Now let's go to the rates. The default rates are, let's say, slightly conservative and should satisfy not the most advanced and good FPV pilots. However, if you know what you are doing behind the stick and you know how to fly, the default 700 on roll and pitch and the 600 on the yaw is probably slightly too low. It's still fine to go to maybe not 950, but probably 850 on roll and pitch and around 700 degrees per second rates. This allows for nicer, more rapid response while doing the flippity floppy over the trees or a meadow or whatever there you have flying on. If, however, you just want to play safe and you just want to cruise, the default rates should be fine. If you want to be able to perform faster maneuvers, raising the rates to 800, 900 or even above, it's already up to you and your personal preference to whatever values are satisfactory for you. Probably there is never, at least I never have a need to modify the roll pitch and yaw expo, because I live with the default expo. On the topic of the max roll angle and max pitch angle, this you should change only if you are using either angle mode or, for example, navigation possibilities like position hold, navigation, return to home. This limits how much attitude can be applied to the multirotor. 30 degrees is usually fine for the bigger machines, but on the 5 inches, fast and agile and powerful 5 inches, putting 45 or even 50 degrees on those angles is absolutely fully fine and might result in the nicer and smoother, maybe not smoother, but faster return to home if you activate it. Now, the most interesting things about the INAV 2.5 and the multirotors are hidden in the filters tab. First of all, if you've seen this tab in the INAV 2.4, you might remember there was a section about the static notches on the gyro and on the Dterm. We removed them. They are still configurable via the CLI, however, they are deprecated and will be at least partially removed for the INAV 2.6. Definitely the Dterm notch will be removed and the gyro notch too will be removed. For the 2.5, if you really want to use them, they are still in the CLI and you can get the correct setting names from the documentation. However, we recommend to forget about them completely. They were fine few years ago. Right now there is really no need to use static notches. Instead of static notches, we have mainly two things. One is the matrix gyro filter. I already described what the matrix gyro filter is in the video. The link is in the description, and it's a next iteration of the dynamic filter, dynamic notches. Instead of having one notch, this filter applies 3 notches and really result in the pretty nice noise attenuation in the full spectrum. By default, after applying the multirotor preset, the matrix filter on the gyro is enabled. That means you do not really have to change it. And it also sets the Q factor, which is the, let's say, quality factor. The higher the Q factor, then the more narrow, more precise the attenuation is. The lower the Q factor, the wider attenuation and the less precise the notches is. The default value of 250 seems like a good compromise, and you of course might want to change it if you feel that something is still getting through, but only after really analyzing the black box log. Do not modify this setting blindly. If you are using INAV 2.5 on the fine, good 5-inch multirotor, you also might want to consider raising the mean frequency of this filter from 120 to 150 Hz. Thanks to this, because of the 5 inches have usually pretty high RPM, the filter will start to work only when the propellers will spin fast enough. However, with the default 120, it still will be working just fine. You might shave some of the phase delay, but really like almost nothing on the phase delay, so it's not that important after raising the mean frequency to 150. Of course, if you are flying something bigger, you might want to lower this frequency, but since right now we are talking only about the 5 inches, this is not relevant. The next settings you might consider raising on the 5 incher is the gyro LPF cutoff frequency. This is the first gyro static low pass filter performed by the INAV. The default 110 is rather, let's say, conservative value that should work on even relatively beaten up propellers and the motors. My personal preference when I'm flying INAV 2.5 is boost this value to 120 Hz, because everything else should be nicely handled by all the other filters that we have over there. Also important, it's recommended not to enable the stage 2 LPF on the gyro. With the gyro matrix filter, it's not really necessary to run the second LPF. However, if your black box log shows that you still have some noise above 320 250, 300 Hertz, and it's not going away with the dynamic notches, it's a good idea, but only then to set up stage 2 at around 200, 250 Hertz. But if nothing wrong is really happening, it's suggested to leave those two alone. The next, finally, with the INAV 2.5, we have two low-pass filters on the Dterm. Both low-pass filters are static low-pass, and the values provided by default, I mean 110 Hz on the Dterm low-pass 1 and 170 Hz on the low-pass 2, are fine, absolutely fine for the 5-inch multirotors. Those are actually values I'm using on the very smooth, almost brand new builds. You can raise them by, like, I don't know, 10, maybe even 20 Hertz higher, but only on really smooth builds, because the Dterm really likes to pollute everything with noise. So be really careful while raising those values. And the gyro RPM filter, of course. If you have the RPM ESC telemetry configured and enabled in INAV, then I suggest enabling gyro RPM filter on the INAV 2.5. However, if you do not have such a possibility, because INAV still does not support the bidirectional D-shot, only the classical ESC telemetry, leaving those things on off still should result in pretty, at least, nice flight without much problems. And the last page is the mechanics. To be honest, over here there is nothing really super major you should change. Definitely the anti-gravity gains settings are just fine on defaults. The same goes for the Dterm Relax and the air mode handling type. This is really something that you should not worry about. However, some people say when you are really flying freestyle, setting the Dterm Relax to gyro will give you slightly better handling. However, I'm not the best pilot in the world. I do not really feel much of the difference in handling between both, so I always fly with the Dterm Relax type set points. Probably the only setting that you might want to change, and that changes the feeling of the quad, is the Dterm Setpoint Weight. The higher the Dterm Setpoint Weight, the more snappier the response of the quad will be, because the Dterm not only be used to stabilize the flight, but also boost the initial phase of the movement when you move the stick. The default are something like a compromise between really snappy flight with the Dterm Setpoint Weight above 1 and let's say smooth and maybe not the battery, but I'm looking for them. It's like going through the pudding. The lower with the Dterm Setpoint Weight you will set, the most gentle the response on the stick movements will be. Like I said, the default 0.75 is a nice compromise. If you want a snappier response, raise this value. If, however, you want more gentle response, more smooth response, slower starts, slower ends of the maneuvers, you might lower this value slightly. I'm personally on my freestyle machines I'm using the default 0.75, and it gives me pretty decent feeling in the air. That is the feeling I like. If, however, I would be using this for more aggressive, like gate hitting, snappy maneuver, then raising the Dterm Setpoint Weight higher might be a good idea. By the way, INAV 2.5 is the last version of INAV that is still using the Dterm Setpoint Weight. With the INAV 2.6, there will be something else. And that is all. Those were the most important settings for your 5-inch multirotor drone running INAV 2.5. Bottom line, the default values applied by the configurator are fine for, let's say, not much demanding users that just want their quads to fly. However, when you want your quad to fly better, pay attention to those slight details and increase the few of the values I suggest you might want to increase. So from the top, this is the derivative, kinda important, the leveling strength on the PID level, thrust speed attenuation, rates, which you might want to use slightly faster rates, filters, which by default are usually fine, although slightly raising the gyro LPF cutoff frequency gives a pretty nice results, enabling the gyro RPM filters if you have the ESC telemetry enabled, but of course the matrix filter will be always there, and in the mechanics modifying the Dterm Setpoint Weight. And that's all for today. Until the next one. Bye bye.